"He never spoke to me. What did you do?" yelled the millionaire at the street girl. "And the reason was..." "If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from." Let's begin. A light rain fell over the Upper East Side, a prestigious neighborhood in New York City, as Bernard Vanderbilt watched the city from the top of his penthouse apartment. At 36, the businessman had accumulated achievements, awards, and assets, but his eyes carried an irreparable absence. His son, Raphael, just 5 years old, had not uttered a single word since the incident with his mother, Helen. None of the hired specialists had managed to explain the boy's silence. Cognitively healthy, Raphael simply refused to communicate with the world. He lived immersed in his own patterns. He would build towers of blocks, always with 7 pieces, only in the color orange, and with an almost ritualistic precision. The doctors said it was a complex emotional manifestation, a kind of silent language, but nothing brought definitive answers. Bernard was no longer seeking explanations. He was seeking miracles. The businessman sighed, resting his forehead against the cold glass of the panoramic window that displayed the grey metropolis. His real estate development empire continued to grow, but his heart shrank with each day he didn't hear his son's voice. He had consulted the best specialists in the United States, even traveled abroad, visiting reference centers for child communication. Nothing. Raphael remained in his private world, protected by a silence that seemed impenetrable. On that rainy June afternoon, a call from the front desk broke the routine. Anthony, the building's security guard, informed him that there was a young girl alone, sitting under the building's awning for hours, refusing to leave. She wanted to speak with him and with the boy. Something about that insistence made Bernard go down personally. "Mr. Vanderbilt, I've tried everything, but she says she'll only leave if she speaks with you," Anthony explained, embarrassed. Upon opening the building's door, Bernard found a frail child, no more than 7 years old, soaked, wrapped in a frayed pink coat. Her dark skin and curly hair dripped with rainwater, but the girl's gaze did not waver. She said her name was Ilara and stated with an unusual conviction that she could make Raphael speak. "How do you know my son?" Bernard asked, suspicious and intrigued at the same time. "I don't know him, but I know what he's like," Ilara replied with a disconcerting maturity. "I know he only plays with orange blocks. I know he always goes to the kitchen at 4:15 p.m. to drink water from a blue cup. I know he's afraid of thunder." Bernard felt a chill. Those details were far too intimate. Not even he had noticed the precise time Raphael walked to the kitchen. "How could this child know? Who sent you here? Is this some kind of joke?" he questioned, looking around for any adult who might be behind this. "Nobody sent me. Grandma Gemma taught me to see the patterns in people. She says some children speak without words, and I can understand," Ilara explained, without looking away. Bernard considered sending her away, thinking it was just another childish fantasy or even a setup, but he hesitated. It had been months since he had felt any hope. There was something in that girl's eyes that intrigued him deeply. "Where are you from? Where are your parents?" he asked, still suspicious. "I live with my grandma in Greenwich Village. My parents are traveling," the girl answered with a serenity that seemed too improvised for her age. Impressed and seized by a remnant of hope he no longer knew how to cultivate, he allowed Ilara to enter. Despite the discomfort of the housekeeper, Mrs. Gladys, the girl was received and fed. The woman looked suspiciously at the soaked child sitting at the kitchen table, devouring a bowl of hot soup. "Mr. Bernard, are you sure about this? We don't know who this girl is, where she came from. It could be dangerous," Mrs. Gladys whispered, watching Ilara from the kitchen doorway. "Just for today, Gladys. Something tells me it's worth a try," Bernard replied, unable to explain the decision even to himself. Shortly after, Ilara was led to the room where Raphael spent his afternoons, isolated with his blocks. The boy was sitting on the soft rug, surrounded by perfectly aligned towers of orange blocks. His brown hair fell over his concentrated eyes, and his expression was too serious for such a small child. What happened next surprised everyone. For the first time, Raphael did not hide from a stranger. He watched Ilara attentively, not as someone scared, but as someone recognizing something familiar. The girl didn't try to touch him, just sat on the floor at a respectful distance and began to arrange small objects from the room into simple geometric shapes. "A toy car, a pen," A small book, arranged in a perfect triangle. Raphael, after a few minutes, responded. He reproduced the pattern, created another. Ilara replicated it. A silent dialogue had begun without words, but with an intensity Bernard had never witnessed. The businessman watched, dumbfounded, as his son interacted with a stranger in a way he never had with him. The rain continued to fall outside, but the apartment seemed illuminated by a new light. Bernard didn't dare to interfere, just watched that mysterious communication for over an hour. When the clock struck 6 p.m., Raphael stood up and did something unprecedented. He took Ilara's hand and led her to his room. "It's getting late," Bernard said, finally interrupting. "We need to take you home. Your grandmother must be worried." "Grandma Gemma knows where I am," Ilara replied with that disconcerting certainty, "but I can call her." On the call, Bernard was surprised to hear a calm-voiced old woman agree to let her granddaughter spend the night at his house. There was something in Gemma's voice that unsettled him. It was as if she had been expecting that phone call. In the days that followed, Ilara began to live in the penthouse on a temporary basis. The businessman wanted to understand who this girl was, where she came from, how she knew so much about his son. She said she had learned everything from her grandmother. Gemma, a woman who, according to Ilara, possessed the gift of seeing the hidden patterns in people's emotions. Grandma says everyone talks all the time, even when they're quiet. "You just have to pay attention to the patterns," the girl explained while playing with Raphael. To Bernard, it sounded like superstition, but the results were too concrete to be ignored. Raphael was beginning to laugh. He spent more time awake, slept with fewer nightmares. His gaze was no longer empty. But still the silence remained. A week after Ilara's arrival, Bernard finally decided to meet Gemma. He drove his Range Rover through the narrow streets of Greenwich Village until he found an old house, painted yellow, with a small flower garden in front. The door was opened by a black woman with grey hair, tied in an elegant bun, dressed in a colourful tunic. "I was expecting your visit, Mr. Vanderbilt," she said, before he could even introduce himself. "Come in, the tea is ready." The house was simple but welcoming, filled with plants, books and small objects, arranged in patterns that resembled the ones Ilara created with Raphael. On the kitchen table, 2 cups of tea were waiting. Bernard felt a shiver down his spine. "How did you know I would come today?" Gemma smiled, a wise smile that lit up her time-worn face. "The patterns, Mr. Vanderbilt, always the patterns. Please sit down." During their conversation, Bernard discovered that Gemma was a respected retired teacher, specializing in children with special needs. She spoke with authority about nonverbal communication, childhood trauma, and the various ways children find to process pains they cannot name. "Does your granddaughter have some kind of special training?" Bernard asked, still incredulous at the instant connection Ilara had established with Raphael. "Ilara was born with a gift, Mr. Vanderbilt. She sees what most of us ignore. It's not training, it's sensitivity. Something rare these days." But how did she know about Raphael, about the details of his routine? Gemma became serious. "There are things I cannot explain rationally. Call it intuition if you prefer. What matters is that your son is finding a way to communicate again. Isn't that what you desire?" Bernard couldn't argue. It was exactly what he desired most in the world. Back at the apartment, he found Ilara and Raphael in the living room, surrounded by colorful blocks. For the first time, there were more than just orange ones. Blues, reds, greens, an explosion of colors that contrasted with the previous monotony. "He's talking more today," Ilara said, smiling. "He's telling a story about a happy day in the park." "How do you know?" Bernard asked, looking at the blocks that to him were just a random arrangement. "Look closely," Ilara pointed. "The green is the grass. The blues are the sky and the lake. The oranges are the 3 of you, him, and—" She hesitated, but Bernard completed. "Helen, his mother." Ilara nodded. "He misses her. He doesn't understand why she went away." Bernard couldn't hide his discomfort. One afternoon, seeing him communicate with Ilara through blocks and gestures and react with tenderness to her presence, the businessman, overcome by frustration and insecurity, confronted the girl. He didn't shout, but the pain in his voice was clear. "Why has my son never spoken to me? What do you have that I don't? What did you do?" Ilara just stared at him with that strange maturity for her age. She offered no direct answers, just continued helping Raphael organize the objects. That night, Bernard didn't sleep. He spent hours in his office reviewing recordings from the apartment's security cameras, observing the patterns Raphael had created over the months. He began to notice repetitions, symbols, sequences of colors and shapes that seemed to tell stories. When the sun rose, Bernard's eyes were red and his mind was racing. He realized that all this time his son had been trying to communicate, but he had never stopped to really look, to see beyond the words he so desperately demanded. That morning, for the first time since Helen's departure, Bernard cancelled all his appointments. He sat on the floor next to his son and began to play with the blocks. Raphael watched him, suspicious at first, then curious. Bernard created a simple pattern, 3 orange blocks side by side. "This is us, Raphael. You, me, and Mommy, always together even when she's not here." The boy looked at his father for a long time, then at the blocks. Slowly he separated one of the orange blocks, placing it further away. "I know," Bernard said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Mommy is far away, but we're still a family." Raphael took more blue blocks and began to place them between the 2 orange blocks, representing him and his father. Bernard frowned, trying to understand. "Are these obstacles?" he ventured. "Things that separate us." But the boy shook his head no. He continued adding blue blocks, forming a sort of bridge between the 2 orange blocks. It was Ilara who, observing from the doorway, translated, "He's saying that you two need to build a new path together. The old path ended when she left." That afternoon, Bernard took Raphael and Ilara for a walk in Central Park. It was the first time in 2 years that the boy had agreed to leave the house without protest. They walked through the gardens, watched the swans on the lake, bought popcorn. Raphael didn't speak, but his eyes shone with a long-forgotten vivacity. While the boy watched the swans, Bernard took the opportunity to talk to Ilara. "Gemma told me you were born with a gift. But I have a feeling there's more to this story. How did you really know about Raphael?" Ilara hesitated, looking at the lake. "Grandma says some things don't need to be explained to be true. I need to know. Ilara, I need to understand so I can help my son." The girl took a deep breath. "I dreamed about him. Several nights in a row. I saw a boy who didn't speak, but who built towers of orange blocks. I saw a sad father looking at the city, and I saw—" She stopped as if something was preventing her from continuing. "You saw what, Ilara?" "I saw a woman. She was trying to say something important. Something about the boy. About why he stopped talking." Bernard felt a chill run down his spine. "You saw Helen?" "Raphael's mother." Ilara nodded slowly. "In the dream, she was worried. She wanted someone to help the boy speak. Not about what happened to her, but about something that happened before. Something she discovered." "What are you talking about?" Bernard tensed up. "Helen suffered a sudden stroke. It was natural, unexpected. In the dreams, the woman said it wasn't natural. She discovered something. Something about medicines and experiments." Bernard felt his blood run cold. Ilara's words awakened a memory he had buried deep inside. Helen, in the weeks before she passed, had been agitated, worried. She spoke of irregularities she had discovered at the clinic where she worked as a nurse. She had mentioned the name of the chief physician, Dr. Richard, several times. Bernard, busy with his expanding company, hadn't paid proper attention. "That's impossible," he murmured, more to himself than to Ilara. "How could you know that?" "I can't explain it, Mr. Bernard. I just know that Raphael needs to feel safe to speak. He saw something that night, something that scared him so much that the words got stuck." Bernard looked at his son, who was throwing breadcrumbs to the swans, oblivious to their conversation. A terrible thought began to form in his mind. What if Helen hadn't passed from natural causes? What if Raphael had witnessed something a child should never see? The businessman decided it was time to investigate further. He needed to find out what really happened to his wife and what secret his son carried in silence. Upon returning to the apartment, Bernard noticed something different in Raphael's behavior. The boy seemed more anxious, restless. Upon entering the house, he ran to his collection of blocks and began to build something different, a more complex structure, using not only the usual orange blocks but also blue and for the first time a black block. "What is he building?" Bernard asked Ilara. The girl observed for a few moments, then replied, "It looks like a hospital, or a clinic. The clinic where Helen worked." Bernard ventured. Raphael looked at his father upon hearing his mother's name and nodded vigorously. Then he took a small doll from the toy chest, one representing a nurse, and placed it next to the construction. And next he positioned another figure, a man in a lab coat, in a threatening posture over the nurse. "Dr. Richard?" Bernard asked, his throat dry. The boy nodded again, his eyes now welling up. He took another, smaller doll and hid it behind a door in the structure he had created. "You were there," Bernard concluded, feeling a huge weight in his chest. "You saw something, didn't you?" Raphael began to tremble, knocking over some blocks. Elara approached him gently and held his hand. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to show everything today. We can continue tomorrow." The boy calmed down, but his gaze remained restless, as if a whirlwind of emotions and memories had been awakened by the walk in the park. That night, for the first time in years, Raphael asked to sleep in his father's room, without words, just by taking his blanket and pillow and dragging them to Bernard's room. The businessman lay down beside his son, watching his serene little face as he slept. A determination grew within him. He would discover the truth, no matter how painful. For Raphael, for Helen, for all of them. The next morning, Bernard made a call he had been avoiding for a long time. He needed to speak with Helen's mother, Mrs. Cecilia, with whom he had broken off relations after his daughter's passing. It was time to gather all the pieces of that silent puzzle. The rain had started falling over New York City again, as if the sky shared the tension that hung over that fragmented family. As he watched the drops run down the window, Bernard felt he was about to uncover a secret that would change their lives forever. Mrs. Cecilia lived in a small apartment in Chinatown. Bernard hesitated before ringing the doorbell, remembering the last tense encounter they had at Helen's funeral. On that occasion, the woman had blamed him for not noticing the signs, for being absent when her daughter needed him most. Harsh words that now were beginning to make sense. When the door opened, it revealed a tired-looking woman with grey hair and eyes that resembled Helen's. Upon seeing Bernard, her expression hardened. "What do you want after all this time?" she asked, not hiding her bitterness. "I need your help, Mrs. Cecilia. It's about Raphael. I believe he witnessed something the night the night of the incident. Something related to her work at the clinic." The mention of her grandson softened the woman's expression. She hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing Bernard to enter. The apartment was simple but cozy, filled with photographs of Helen at different stages of her life. One in particular caught Bernard's attention. Helen in her nurse's uniform, smiling next to Dr. Richard at a clinic event. The image seemed to belong to a previous life when everything was still fine. "How is my grandson?" Cecilia asked, pouring a strong coffee for Bernard. "He's still not speaking. But now there's a girl, Elara, who somehow manages to communicate with him. Through her, I've discovered that Raphael may have witnessed something disturbing." Bernard explained about the block patterns, about the structures Raphael built, about the doctor doll threatening the nurse. Cecilia listened in silence, her face going through various emotions. Helen was restless in the weeks before. "Before the incident," she said finally. "She started visiting me more often, leaving Raphael here, saying she needed to check on some things at the clinic outside of work hours." "Did she mention anything specific about Dr. Richard?" Cecilia looked at the photograph on the wall, her gaze filled with suspicion. Helen admired him at first. He was considered a genius, a pioneer in neurological treatments. But something changed. She started asking questions, investigating some procedures. She talked about patients who had unexpected reactions to certain medications, about protocols that weren't being followed correctly. Did she suspect medical negligence? Bernard questioned, his heart quickening. Worse, she mentioned something about unauthorized experiments. She said some patients were being used as guinea pigs without their knowledge or consent. Bernard felt a shiver run down his spine. Helen was known for her unwavering professional ethics, her dedication to her patients. If she had discovered something of this magnitude, she certainly wouldn't have stayed silent. "Do you think Helen confronted Dr. Richard about this?" Cecilia nodded slowly. "The last time we saw each other 2 days before the incident, she was determined. She said she had gathered enough evidence and was going to take it all to the Medical Ethics Board. She was nervous but resolute. She said it was her duty as a nurse and as a human being." A heavy silence fell in the room. Bernard felt a lump in his throat. Helen had always been brave, full of integrity, and he had been too busy with his company to notice the danger she was facing. "And Raphael?" Cecilia asked, interrupting his thoughts. "Do you think he was with Helen when she confronted Dr. Richard?" "It seems so. According to Ilara, he's holding a secret he can't express in words, something that scared him deeply." Cecilia stood up, went to a small dresser and took a yellowish envelope from a drawer. "Helen left this with me on her last visit. She said that if anything happened to her, I should give it to you. I confess I thought about throwing it away after she was gone. I was so angry at you, at your absence, at the way you immersed yourself in work and left my daughter to face who knows what alone." She handed the envelope to Bernard, who took it with trembling hands. "I didn't open it," Cecilia continued. "I respected her wish, but maybe the answers you're looking for are in there." Bernard opened the envelope. Inside he found several documents, copies of medical records, notes in Helen's neat handwriting, and a USB drive. As he read the first documents, his blood ran cold. Helen had discovered that Dr. Richard was testing an experimental neurological drug on vulnerable patients, falsifying records to make it seem like he was administering conventional treatments. The goal was to accelerate the development of a revolutionary drug that would treat dementia and Alzheimer's, but the side effects were severe and were being covered up. "My God," Bernard murmured. She was about to expose a criminal scheme, and she paid a high price for her courage, and Cecilia added, her voice choked with emotion. Bernard put the documents back in the envelope, his mind racing. He needed to analyze everything calmly, check the contents of the USB drive, understand the extent of the scheme. More importantly, he needed to protect Raphael, who was potentially a key witness. "Mrs. Cecilia, I'd like you to visit Raphael. Perhaps the presence of his grandmother can help him feel safer." The woman smiled for the first time since Bernard had arrived. "I would love to see my grandson. I miss him so much." Upon returning to his apartment, Bernard found Raphael and Ilara playing in the living room. The boy seemed calmer than the previous night. He had built something that looked like a house with the blocks, using all the available colors. "It's Grandma Gemma's house," Ilara explained, smiling. "He wants to meet her." Bernard nodded, thoughtful. "Maybe soon. First, your Grandma Cecilia will come to visit. She misses you, Raphael." Upon hearing his grandmother's name, the boy looked up, a spark of recognition lighting his eyes. He quickly took more blocks and began to build another structure next to the first one. "Grandma Cecilia's house?" Bernard ventured. Raphael nodded, stacking red and yellow blocks, Mrs. Cecilia's favorite colors. For the first time in a long time, Bernard felt they were making progress, slowly rebuilding the bridges broken by the tragedy. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Bernard locked himself in his office to analyze the documents and the USB drive left by Helen. The contents were even more alarming than he had imagined. Dr. Richard not only tested unapproved drugs on patients, he also manipulated the results, concealing serious side effects, including deaths. And there was a pattern in the documents. All the patients belonged to vulnerable groups: elderly people with no close family, people from low-income communities, undocumented immigrants, people whose absence would hardly raise suspicion. In a text file, Helen had left a detailed account of her findings, including dates, names, and procedures. The last paragraph was particularly unsettling. "Richard knows I'm investigating. I've noticed him watching me, changing shifts to coincide with mine, asking seemingly casual questions about my routine. Today I found my locker rummaged through. I fear he suspects I have proof. I'm leaving this record as evidence in case something happens to me. Bernard, if you are reading this, protect our son. Raphael could be in danger. If Richard finds out he was with me that night at the clinic, look for Dr. Marissa at St. Monica's Hospital. She has the toxicology reports that prove what I'm saying." Bernard felt a tightness in his chest. Helen knew she was at risk, and yet she had continued her investigation. And Richard? Was it possible that he was behind what happened to Helen? That it hadn't been a natural stroke, but something induced? The idea was so monstrous that Bernard hesitated to consider it. He needed more information. He needed to talk to this Dr. Marissa. But above all, he needed to ensure Raphael's safety. If the boy had indeed witnessed a confrontation between his mother and Dr. Richard, and if the latter suspected it, the child could be in danger. The next morning, Bernard woke up early and made a call to his head of security, Charles. He needed to reinforce the protection around the apartment and hire additional security to accompany Raphael and Ilara. He also requested a full background check on Dr. Richard, professional history, finances, connections, everything. While organizing these measures, he received a call from Gemma, Ilara's grandmother. "Mr. Vanderbilt, we need to talk," she said with an unusual urgency in her voice. "It's about Ilara and Raphael. There's something you need to know." "Did something happen to the children?" Bernard asked, alarmed. "No, they're fine. But I had, let's say, a very strong intuition tonight. I believe the past is about to reveal itself in a way we might not be prepared to face." There was something in Gemma's voice that made Bernard take her words seriously, despite the almost mystical tone. "Can we meet today?" he proposed. "I'll bring the children to visit you." "That would be perfect. And, Mr. Vanderbilt, also bring what Helen left for you." "The documents." Bernard was silent for a few seconds, surprised. "How do you know about the documents?" "There are more connections in this story than you imagine." "Come in the afternoon. I'll be waiting." The call ended, leaving Bernard uneasy. Gemma seemed to know details he hadn't shared with her. Was the woman somehow involved in Helen and Dr. Richard's story? Later, with Raphael and Ilara in the back seat of the car, protected by Charles and another security guard, Bernard drove to Gemma's house in Greenwich Village. The feeling that they were being watched never left him. Twice he thought he noticed the same dark vehicle following them, but he lost it in the heavy traffic. Gemma's yellow house seemed even more vibrant under the afternoon sun. The flower garden exuded a sweet perfume that invited calm. The woman was waiting for them on the porch, wearing a colorful dress that matched the surroundings. "Welcome," she said, opening a warm smile to the children. "Ilara, why don't you take Raphael to see the fish in the backyard?" As the children walked away, Gemma led Bernard to the kitchen, where a table was set with cornbread and coffee. The security guards remained outside, alert. "Did you bring what I asked for?" Gemma asked as soon as they sat down. Bernard placed the envelope on the table. "How did you know about this?" Gemma sighed, pouring coffee for both of them. "I met Helen a few years ago. She treated my husband at the clinic shortly before he passed away. She was one of the few professionals who truly cared, who saw John as a person, not just a case." "You never mentioned this before," Bernard observed, surprised. "Not everything needs to be said in the first meeting," Gemma replied with a small smile. "Helen and I kept in touch even after John's passing. She started visiting me, sometimes bringing Raphael. The boy loved the fish in the backyard." Bernard tried to process the information. Raphael knew Gemma. That would explain why he felt comfortable with Ilara from the first moment. "Why didn't you tell me this? Why did Ilara pretend not to know Raphael?" "We didn't pretend anything. Ilara really didn't know your son. She was born after Helen, after the incident, and Raphael was very young when he visited this house. I doubt he remembers clearly. What exists is a connection, a sensitivity that Ilara inherited from me, the ability to see beyond the obvious, to read the patterns that other people ignore." "Are you saying you have some kind of psychic gift?" Bernard questioned, skeptical. Gemma laughed softly. "Call it what you will. Heightened intuition, extreme sensitivity, expanded perception. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that Helen trusted me. She shared her concerns about Dr. Richard, and I believe your son is in danger." Bernard told Gemma about the documents, about Helen's suspicions, about the possibility that Raphael had witnessed something at the clinic. The woman listened attentively, nodding occasionally. "Helen visited me 2 days before she passed," Gemma said after a moment of silence. "She was agitated, said she had discovered something terrible, something involving many important people. She mentioned she was being followed, that she feared for her safety and Raphael's. I asked if she had spoken to you, and she said she had tried, but you were too busy with the company." The guilt hit Bernard like a physical blow. He remembered the unanswered calls, the postponed conversations because he was in important meetings, the last-minute cancelled family dinners. Helen had tried to warn him, and he hadn't been there to listen. "What else did Helen say?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "She said she was going to confront Richard that night, that she had enough evidence to bring down his scheme. She asked that if anything happened to her, I would look after Raphael. That I would help him speak again when it was safe. What do you mean, speak again? Raphael wasn't already speaking before. Your son spoke normally until that night, Mr. Vanderbilt. The trauma of what he witnessed silenced him. Bernard felt dizzy. All these years he had believed Raphael's silence was a reaction to the grief of losing his mother. But if the boy had already stopped speaking on the same night, even before knowing his mother wouldn't return. My God, he murmured, running his hands over his face. He saw something terrible happen to Helen, something that traumatized him deeply. And probably involving Dr. Richard, Gemma added. That's why Ilara showed up at your door. The girl had dreams, visions about Raphael, about the boy who held a secret so heavy that words couldn't carry it. Bernard looked out the window, watching Raphael and Ilara crouched by the small pond, observing the colorful fish. His son carried a huge burden for such a small child. And now that burden could put him in danger. What should we do? He asked, feeling more lost than ever. First, find Dr. Marissa, as Helen suggested. Then gather more evidence, and, most importantly, create an environment where Raphael feels safe to finally release the words trapped in his heart. And what about Dr. Richard? If he's really responsible for what happened to Helen, we can't just confront him without concrete proof. And if he finds out we're investigating, Gemma held Bernard's hand firmly. We need to be smarter than him. Helen gathered evidence. We'll use that to our advantage. And remember, now Raphael has Ilara. She is the bridge he needed to start communicating again. At that moment, the children ran into the kitchen, their faces lit with the innocence they still managed to preserve despite everything. Raphael held a yellow flower picked from the garden, which he shyly offered to Gemma. Thank you, my dear, she said, accepting the gift with a warm smile. You remember me, don't you? From the last time you were here with your mother. To Bernard's surprise, Raphael nodded slowly. His eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness. It was as if a veil of confusion had been lifted, allowing long-buried memories to re-emerge. He remembers, Bernard murmured, moved. He remembers you, your house. Children never truly forget, Mr. Vanderbilt. They just store memories in different places, sometimes inaccessible to adults. But they are there, waiting for the right moment to resurface. On the way back home, Bernard couldn't stop thinking about everything he had discovered. Raphael's silence wasn't just a reaction to loss. It was a protection, a shield against a truth he had witnessed that was too heavy to be expressed in words. Helen hadn't had a natural stroke. She had been silenced because she discovered something terrible. And Gemma wasn't just the grandmother of an extraordinary girl. She was a direct connection to Helen, an ally she herself had chosen to protect Raphael when she no longer could. The puzzle was starting to come together, but crucial pieces were still missing. Who else was involved in Dr. Richard's scheme? How big were the interests behind those illegal experiments? And most importantly, how could they prove Helen had been silenced without putting Raphael in even more danger? Upon arriving at the apartment, Bernard was greeted by Mrs. Gladys with a worried expression. Sir, there's a man who has been waiting for you for almost an hour. He said it's important that it's about Dr. Richard. Bernard's heart raced. He looked at the children who had fallen asleep in the car and were now being carried by the security guards. Who is this man? Did he identify himself? Yes, sir. He said his name is Lucas and that he was a nurse at the clinic. He said he worked with Mrs. Helen. A new character entered the scene, bringing with him the promise of more answers, or perhaps more questions, to the mystery involving life, science, and the silence of a child who had witnessed something no innocent eyes should ever see. Lucas was sitting in the living room, visibly nervous. He was a man of about 30, thin with dark circles under his eyes that betrayed sleepless nights. Upon seeing Bernard, he stood up abruptly, running his hands through his disheveled hair. Mr. Vanderbilt, thank you for seeing me, he said, his voice trembling. I know showing up like this, unannounced, is inconvenient, but this is urgent. Bernard gestured for the security guards to stay close and indicated for Lucas to sit down again. Mrs. Gladys had already taken the children to their rooms, ensuring they were away from this potentially disturbing conversation. How did you get my address? Bernard asked, remaining standing in a position that demonstrated authority. Helen, your wife, mentioned where you lived a few times. It wasn't hard to confirm. Lucas hesitated, then continued. I worked with her for almost 3 years at the NeuroLife clinic. We were friends. She trusted me. And why are you here now, 2 years after what happened to her? Lucas swallowed hard, glancing around quickly as if afraid of being overheard. Because I believe what happened to Helen wasn't natural. And because I saw your son at the clinic that night. Bernard felt a chill run down his spine. So it was true. Raphael had been with Helen at the clinic the night she passed. Go on, he ordered, finally sitting in an armchair opposite Lucas. Helen had been investigating some irregular procedures for months. At first it was just suspicions, small inconsistencies in the records, doses that didn't add up, unregistered side effects. But then she started gathering more concrete evidence. She discovered that Dr. Richard was testing an experimental drug called neuroxin on vulnerable patients, without proper consent. What does this drug do exactly? It was a revolutionary drug for treating neurodegenerative diseases, especially Alzheimer's. In theory, it could reverse brain damage, restore lost neural connections. But animal trials showed severe side effects, including cerebral hemorrhages. Approval for human trials had been denied several times by regulatory agencies. Bernard remembered the stroke that, according to the doctors, had taken Helen. The coincidence was too disturbing to ignore. Richard was testing this drug without approval? Why, what was the goal? Lucas laughed bitterly. Money, obviously. BioNeuro, the company funding the research, had invested millions in neuroxin's development. If they could get the drug approved, the profits would be astronomical. But the official trials were taking too long, and the investors were pushing for results. And Helen discovered all of this. Yes, she found falsified records, compared them with the real ones, identified patients who had died after receiving neuroxin, but whose causes of death were attributed to complications of their original diseases. She was determined to expose everything. Why didn't you help her? Why didn't you stop her from confronting Richard alone? Bernard couldn't contain the bitterness in his voice. Lucas looked down, visibly ashamed. I was scared. The scheme involved powerful people, not just Richard. There were executives from BioNeuro, other doctors, even a director from the Food and Drug Administration. Helen was too brave, or too naive to realize the danger she was in. And that night, what happened exactly? Lucas took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to relive the memory. Helen called me at the end of the day. She was agitated. She said she had gotten the definitive proof, something that would incriminate Richard with no chance of defense. She asked me to meet her at the clinic after hours. When I arrived, she was already there in Richard's office, confronting him with documents spread across the table. And Raphael, he hesitated, looking at Bernard with an expression of guilt. Raphael was there, sitting in a corner, playing with some blocks Helen always brought for him. Bernard felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. The image of his young son, witnessing a confrontation that would culminate in the loss of his mother, was unbearable. Why would she take Raphael to a confrontation like that? Helen would never put our son at risk. It wasn't planned. From what I understood, she was supposed to leave him with her mother, but something came up. Helen told me you were traveling for work, that she had no choice but to bring the boy. Bernard remembered with painful clarity. He was in New York, closing an important deal. A 3-day trip that had extended to a week because negotiations got complicated. A week in which he had barely spoken to Helen and Raphael, always too busy with meetings and business dinners. What happened after you arrived? It was chaotic. Helen was furious, accusing Richard of falsifying results, of using patients as guinea pigs, of being responsible for deaths that could have been avoided. Richard tried to calm her down, said she was exaggerating, that the benefits of neuroxin outweighed the risks. He offered her money to stay quiet. When she refused, he threatened her. What kind of threat? He said he would end her career, that no one would believe a nurse against a respected doctor like him, that he could make her lose custody of Raphael by claiming emotional instability. Bernard clenched his fists, feeling the anger build inside him. How dare Richard threaten his family like that? And then, things escalated quickly. Helen said she had copies of all the documents in safe places, that she had already spoken to a journalist, that she wasn't afraid of him. That's when Richard realized he couldn't buy her or intimidate her. He changed tactics, offered her coffee, said maybe they could find a middle ground. Helen refused the drink. She said she was leaving and would be back the next day with the police. That's when Lucas stopped, swallowing hard. His eyes filled with tears. That's when Richard injected her with something. It was so fast. He took a syringe from his lab coat pocket, and as she turned to get Raphael, he administered it in her arm. Helen looked at him, shocked, then at the syringe, and asked what he had done. Richard just said, "You chose this, Helen. It was you or the project." Bernard felt as if he were being suffocated. The description of Helen's last moments, of the brutal betrayal she had suffered, was almost more than he could bear. "Neuroxin?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "He injected her with the experimental drug?" Lucas nodded. "A concentrated dose. The effects were almost immediate." Helen started to stumble, put her hand to her head, complained of intense pain. Then she collapsed. I ran to help her, tried to do something, but it was too late. The brain damage was massive, irreversible. "And Raphael saw all of it," Bernard whispered, remembering his son's absolute silence since that night. Yes, the boy was paralyzed in a state of shock. He didn't make a single sound, not even when Richard approached him. "Richard approached my son?" Bernard stood up, alarmed. "What did he do?" "Nothing physical. He just crouched in front of him and said something like, 'Now you have a very big secret to keep, don't you, Raphael? Do you know what happens to boys who tell secrets they shouldn't?' I'll never forget the look of terror in your son's eyes. It was like something broke inside him." Bernard walked to the window, trying to control the fury and despair that consumed him. His son had been threatened, traumatized, and he hadn't been there to protect him. Helen had died trying to do the right thing, and he hadn't been there to support her. "Why didn't you report Richard? Why did you let him forge Helen's cause of death as a natural stroke?" Lucas lowered his head, ashamed. "I was scared. Richard threatened me too, said he would implicate me, that he'd say I participated in the illegal trials. He forged documents with my signature to prove it. I would have had my license revoked. I could have even been arrested. And there was the fact that no one would believe me against him. Richard is powerful. He has connections, money. I'm just a nurse. And now? Why are you here after all this time?" Lucas looked up, a new determination shining in his eyes. "Because I can't live with this guilt anymore. Because Richard is still doing the same thing, using new patients as guinea pigs. And because I heard your son still hasn't started speaking again, and that means he's still carrying the weight of that night. No child deserves that." Bernard watched Lucas carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. The man seemed genuinely remorseful, tormented by the choices he had made. "What do you propose?" "I have proof, not as much as Helen had gathered, but enough to start a serious investigation. Records of patients who received neuroxin disguised as conventional drugs, manipulated test results, even a video of a meeting where Richard discusses the experiments with bio-neuro executives. Why did you keep this evidence all this time without doing anything? As a life insurance policy, I knew that if anything happened to me, Richard would be the prime suspect. I left instructions for everything to be sent to the police in case of my unexpected absence." Bernard considered his options. Lucas seemed sincere, but trusting him completely would be naive. On the other hand, the information he brought confirmed what Helen had discovered, what Gemma suspected, and what Raphael's block patterns seemed to communicate. "I need time to verify this information, to compare it with what I already have," he said finally. "And I need to ensure my son's safety above all else." "I understand," Lucas replied, standing up. "But we don't have much time. Richard is about to present the official results of the neuroxin trials at an international conference in 2 weeks. If he gets approval, the drug will be mass-produced and many more people could suffer the same fate as Helen." 2 weeks, Bernard repeated. "It's enough time to build a solid case against him. I hope so. I left a USB drive with copies of all the documents I have with your housekeeper. My contact information is there too. When you decide how you want to proceed, let me know." After Lucas left, Bernard went to check on the children. Raphael and Ilara were sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the disturbing revelations he had just heard. He watched his son's serene face, trying to imagine the horror those innocent eyes had witnessed, the weight of the secret that small heart carried. "I'm going to fix this, son," he whispered. "I'm going to make Richard pay for what he did, and bring your voice back. I promise." The next day, Bernard cancelled all his professional commitments indefinitely, delegating responsibilities to his directors. The company, which had been his priority for so long, now seemed insignificant in the face of what was at stake. He needed to dedicate himself fully to building a case against Richard and, above all, to helping Raphael overcome the trauma that had silenced him. His first action was to contact Dr. Marissa, mentioned by Helen in her notes. He found out she now worked at St. Monica's Hospital as the head of the neurology department. He managed to schedule an appointment for late that afternoon, claiming he wanted a second opinion on Raphael's case. Before that, however, he received Mrs. Cecilia, who arrived promptly at 10 a.m. to visit her grandson. The reunion was emotional. Raphael, upon seeing his grandmother, ran into her arms, something he didn't do with anyone besides Bernard and, more recently, Alara. He didn't speak, but his eyes shone with joyful recognition. "My boy, how you've grown," Cecilia said, with tears in her eyes, hugging her grandson tightly. "I've missed you so much." While Raphael and Alara played under the supervision of Cecilia and Mrs. Gladys, Bernard received Charles, his head of security, in his office. The man brought the preliminary results of the investigation into Richard. "It's worse than we imagined, sir," Charles reported. "Dr. Richard Mendez has connections with influential politicians, receives funding from international pharmaceutical companies, and has a virtually untouchable reputation in the medical community. Several patients have died under his care in the last 5 years, but all cases were attributed to complications of their pre-existing conditions. No one ever questioned it. And what about his finances? There are suspicious transactions, regular deposits from a company called BioNeuro Investments, registered in the Cayman Islands. Significant amounts, far above what would be expected for a medical consultant." "BioNeuro," Bernard murmured, recalling what Lucas had said. "The company funding the development of neuroxin." "Exactly. And there's more. Richard has been watching your house, sir. We've identified a suspicious vehicle circling the neighborhood in recent days, always at the same times. The driver was identified as a private security guard hired by Richard. The information confirmed Bernard's fears. Richard knew he was investigating, probably suspected that Raphael might eventually reveal what he had witnessed. Reinforce security. I want 24-hour teams both here and at Gemma's house. And I need you and your team to review all the documents Lucas provided. Compare them with what we got from Mrs. Cecilia and what I found on Helen's USB drive." "We're already working on it, sir. But if I may be frank, I believe we need outside help. This goes beyond a corporate investigation. We're talking about a possible crime, a conspiracy involving doctors, pharmaceutical companies, and maybe even regulatory agencies." "I agree. I've already contacted a friend in the district attorney's office. He's coming tonight to talk. But we need to have a solid case before we officially involve the authorities. Richard has influence. He could easily quash everything if we don't have irrefutable proof." In the afternoon, Bernard took Raphael to his appointment with Dr. Marissa. Alara insisted on accompanying them, arguing that she could help the boy feel more comfortable. The doctor received them in her office, a large, welcoming room decorated with paintings of serene landscapes. "Mr. Vanderbilt, it's a pleasure to meet you," she said, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. "And you must be Raphael. Helen spoke so much about you." Upon hearing his mother's name, Raphael looked intently at the doctor. He took Ilara's hand as if seeking security. "You knew my wife?" Bernard asked, surprised by the familiarity. "Yes, we worked together on a few cases. Helen was an exceptional professional, dedicated to her patients like few others." Dr. Marissa hesitated, then continued. "And she came to me shortly before she passed. She brought some samples for analysis, asked for absolute secrecy." "What kind of samples?" Dr. Marissa looked at the children, then at Bernard, indicating that this might not be an appropriate conversation for little ears. Taking the hint, Bernard asked Ilara to accompany Raphael to the small play area in the corner of the office. "Medication samples," Dr. Marissa explained, lowering her voice. Helen suspected that Dr. Richard was administering an experimental drug to patients without proper consent. She brought syringes, vials, even blood samples from some patients. I asked a colleague in the lab to run detailed analyses discreetly. And what did you discover? We confirmed her suspicions. The medication contained an experimental neurological compound called RL7, the code name for what would later be marketed as neuroxin. The substance interacted with brain receptors in ways we still don't fully understand. But the side effects were alarming. Cerebral hemorrhages, seizures, in some cases even severe behavioral changes. Bernard felt a lump in his throat. This compound. Could it cause a stroke if administered in a high dose? Dr. Marissa looked at him for a long time, as if assessing how much he already knew. Yes, in fact, that's exactly what I suggested to Helen when she contacted me on that last day. She had discovered that Richard planned to test a new, more concentrated formulation, and she feared the risks would be even greater. You spoke to her on the day she... Yes, in the morning. She was agitated, said she had enough evidence to report him, that she was going to confront him that night. Dr. Marissa paused, her eyes filling with tears. I advised her not to go alone, to wait until we had the complete results of the analyses. But Helen was determined. She said that every day of waiting meant more patients at risk. Did she mention she would take Raphael? No, on the contrary, she said she would leave him with her mother. Dr. Marissa looked at the boy, who was playing quietly with Ilara. When I heard what happened, and that Raphael was with her at the clinic, I was shocked. Helen would never deliberately put her son in danger. Something must have changed her plans, Bernard murmured, remembering what Lucas had said. An unforeseen event. Mr. Vanderbilt, I have to ask, Raphael's silence began that night, didn't it? Immediately after the incident? Bernard nodded. He hasn't said a word since. The doctors call it selective mutism, but they never found a physical cause. Because there is no physical cause, Dr. Marissa explained. It's a psychological response to severe trauma. Raphael saw something his child's brain couldn't process. Something so disturbing that the only defense he found was to shut down completely. He saw Richard inject something into Helen. He saw his mother fall. And then he was threatened by the doctor. Dr. Marissa covered her mouth with her hand, horrified. My God, poor child. No child should ever witness something like that. Doctor, I believe Helen was deliberately silenced by Richard, that he used neuroxin to cause what would look like a natural stroke. I have evidence, witnesses, documents. What I need to know is there any way to prove 2 years later that what happened to Helen wasn't natural? The doctor reflected for a few moments. It would be extremely difficult. RL7 is metabolized quickly by the body. It wouldn't leave traces after so much time, unless... She stopped, thoughtful. Helen mentioned she was collecting tissue samples from patients who had died after receiving the medication. She said she kept them frozen in a safe place. If those samples still exist, and if we can compare them with the analyses we did on the samples she brought me, where would these samples be? I don't know. Helen didn't want to tell me for my own safety, but she mentioned a code, where the sun rises for Raphael. She said I would understand if it became necessary. Bernard frowned, trying to decipher the riddle. Where the sun rises for Raphael. What did Helen mean by that? Where the sun rises, the east. Was there something significant to the east for Raphael? He was interrupted in his thoughts by Ilara, who approached discreetly. Mr. Bernard, Raphael wants to show the doctor something, she said, in her soft voice. Raphael had built something with the blocks available in the office, a structure resembling a building with a yellow circle on top. What is this, Raphael? Dr. Marissa asked, kneeling beside the boy. Ilara, as always, translated, It's Grandma Cecilia's house. Raphael says it's where the sun rises first, because it's on top of a hill. Bernard and Dr. Marissa exchanged meaningful glances. Where the sun rises for Raphael, Mrs. Cecilia's house, Helen must have hidden the samples there, trusting her mother would keep them safe. Raphael, are you saying Mommy kept something important at Grandma's house? Bernard asked, trying to contain his emotion. The boy nodded, then took another yellow block and placed it next to the structure, pointing at it insistently. The sun, Ilara translated. He's saying the sun is important. Sun, Bernard murmured, trying to understand. Sun, sunlight, sun rays. Or a sunroom, Dr. Marissa suggested, her eyes shining with the discovery. Does Mrs. Cecilia have a sunroom at her house? A greenhouse, a conservatory? Bernard tried to remember. It had been so long since he had visited his mother-in-law that the details of her house were hazy in his memory. But then he recalled, yes, she does. A small conservatory at the back of the house, where she grows orchids. Helen loved that place. She said it was where she could truly breathe. And does this sunroom have a refrigerator or freezer? Dr. Marissa questioned. I'm not sure, but it makes sense that Helen would choose a place that meant so much to her. A place where Raphael would feel happy, a place connected to the sun, to life. Bernard looked at his son, who was watching him with bright eyes, as if relieved to have finally communicated something so important. Raphael, you're amazing, he said, hugging the boy tightly. We're going to find what Mommy saved, I promise. As they left the office, Bernard had a new sense of urgency. They needed to go to Mrs. Cecilia's house immediately, check the sunroom, look for what Helen had hidden there. Each new discovery brought them closer to the truth, but also increased the danger they faced. On the way to the car, he noticed a man watching them from across the street, tall in a dark suit with a discreet earpiece. It could have just been any executive, but something in his posture alerted Bernard. He pulled Raphael and Ilara closer, quickening his pace. Charles, he called through the communicator the security guard had given him. I think we're being followed. Man in a dark suit on the opposite sidewalk. We've already identified him, sir, Charles replied promptly. One of Richard's security guards. Stay calm and proceed to the car. We have the situation under control. As he got into the armored vehicle, Bernard looked at the children in the back seat. Raphael seemed calm, almost relieved, as if each step toward the truth was also a step toward freeing the words he had kept locked away for so long. Ilara held his hand, a constant and comforting presence. Are we going to see Grandma Cecilia? The girl asked, noticing the direction the car was taking. Yes, Bernard replied, exchanging a meaningful look with Charles, who was driving. And we're going to find something very important that Raphael's mother left there. Something that will help us understand everything that happened. As the car moved through the streets of New York, Bernard couldn't stop thinking about Helen, about her courage, her determination to do the right thing, even knowing the risks, about how she had planned every detail, left clues that only the right people could decipher. She had trusted that he would eventually discover the truth, that he would protect Raphael, that he would finish what she had started. I'm following your steps. Helen, he thought, looking up at the cloudy New York sky. And I'm going to finish what you started. For you, for our son, for the truth. The small sunroom at the back of Mrs. Cecilia's house was an oasis of life and color. Orchids of different species bloomed on carefully arranged shelves. The late afternoon light filtered through the glass ceiling, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Raphael ran immediately to the center of the space, where a wooden bench surrounded by ferns offered a perfect place for contemplation. He always loved this place, Cecilia commented, watching her grandson with tenderness. Helen brought him here almost every weekend. They would spend hours admiring the flowers, telling stories. Bernard looked around, searching for anything that could serve as a hiding place. There was no freezer in sight, no equipment that could keep samples frozen. Had they misinterpreted Helen's message? Mrs. Cecilia, did Helen ever bring anything to store here? Something that needed to be kept refrigerated, perhaps? The woman frowned, thoughtful. Not that I remember. She always helped with the orchids, but never— Cecilia stopped abruptly, as if a memory had suddenly surfaced. Wait. About 2 weeks before the incident, Helen brought a small cooler. She said it was samples for a special project at the hospital, something that needed to be kept at a controlled temperature. She asked me to keep it in my old freezer, the one I keep in the shed. And do you know if that cooler is still there? It should be. I never touched it. Helen said it was important, that someone would come for it one day. I imagine that someone is you. Bernard exchanged glances with Charles, who had accompanied them as security. The shed was at the back of the property, a small building Cecilia used for storage. Upon entering, they found the mentioned freezer, an old but functional model. Opening it under some packages of frozen food was a white cooler with the St. Monica's Hospital logo. This is it, Bernard murmured, feeling a mix of apprehension and relief. We need to get this to Dr. Marissa immediately. Charles carefully picked up the cooler, checking that it was still properly sealed. Raphael watched everything with unusual intensity, as if he understood the importance of that moment. Grandma, Ilara said suddenly, pointing to a corner of the shed. Raphael wants to show you something over there. The boy had already made his way to an old shelf covered by a dusty tarp. With effort, he was trying to pull something from behind the stacked objects. Bernard approached to help him. removing boxes and old items until he revealed what his son was so interested in, a shoebox decorated with children's drawings. "This box," Cecilia murmured, drawing closer. "Helen decorated it when she was little. She kept her treasures in here. I didn't know it still existed." Raphael took the box reverently and handed it to his father. Upon opening it, Bernard found an old cell phone, handwritten letters, a small notebook, and at the bottom, a yellow USB drive with a label that read, "For B if something happens." Helen left a second set of evidence, Bernard realized, moved by his wife's foresight. She really thought of everything. "She knew the risks," Cecilia commented with tears in her eyes. "Always so meticulous, so careful. My daughter was prepared for any scenario." As they returned to the main room, where Ilara was playing with an elderly cat that belonged to Cecilia, Bernard received an urgent call from Gemma. "Mr. Vanderbilt," said the worried voice of the woman on the other end of the line, "you need to come back immediately. A man was at my house asking about Ilara, about you, about Raphael. I didn't like his demeanor." There was something threatening in his eyes. "Richard is tracking us," Bernard concluded, alarmed. "He must have discovered the connection to Gemma. We're on our way now." They quickly said their goodbyes to Cecilia, who insisted on coming with them. The drive to Gemma's house was tense, with Charles driving alertly for any sign of pursuit. When they arrived, they found the woman on the porch, seemingly calm but with a visible tension in her experienced eyes. "He left about half an hour ago," Gemma informed them as they entered. "He claimed to be a social worker, concerned about Ilara's well-being, but he didn't show me any official identification. He asked questions about you, about the boy, about the connection between the children. He mentioned Dr. Richard as a concerned friend of the family." "The net is closing in," Bernard said. "Richard must suspect we're gathering evidence against him. We need to act quickly." In Gemma's living room, they organized what they had discovered. The cooler contained, as expected, properly labeled and preserved tissue samples. The USB drive was encrypted, but Charles managed to access it using Raphael's date of birth as the password. Inside, they found dozens of documents detailing Richard's scheme, lists of patients used in the trials, emails exchanged with bio-neuro executives, payment records, falsified test results. There were also videos, secret recordings made by Helen of meetings, where Richard openly discussed the experiments. "This is more than enough to incriminate him," Charles stated after reviewing the material. "With the samples Dr. Marissa will analyze, we'll have a solid case." "We need to get all of this to District Attorney Henry today," Bernard decided. "He'll know how to proceed legally." While the adults organized the next steps, Raphael had moved away with Ilara to a corner of the room. Both were unusually quiet, as if they sensed the gravity of the situation. Suddenly, the boy began to build something with blocks that Gemma kept at her house especially for him, a structure resembling the clinic building, and next to it what appeared to be a fallen human figure. "He wants to talk about that night," Ilara said, watching intently. "He's ready." Everyone turned to the boy. Raphael had never shown a willingness to reconstruct the events of that fateful night. On the contrary, he always withdrew when the subject was indirectly mentioned. Now, however, something had changed. With the discovery of the evidence left by Helen, it was as if a weight had been partially lifted from his small shoulders. Bernard approached carefully and sat on the floor next to his son. "It's okay, Raphael," he said in a soft voice. "We're here with you. You're safe." The boy looked into his father's eyes, then at Ilara, who offered him an encouraging smile. Slowly he began to move the blocks, recreating the scene he had witnessed. A blue block represented Dr. Richard, a red one Helen, a small yellow block himself. Moving them, he showed how Richard and Helen argued, how she held papers, how he tried to take something from her hands. "She had proof," Ilara translated, observing the movements. "He wanted to take her proof." Raphael continued, showing Richard offering Helen something to drink, her refusing, turning to get Raphael, and then the crucial moment. The blue block stealthily approaching the red one, a small object being pushed against it. The red block falling. "The injection," Bernard murmured, his throat tightening. "You saw when he injected her with something." Raphael nodded, silent tears streaming down his face. He then moved the blue block close to the yellow one, in a threatening posture. "He threatened you," Bernard said, feeling the anger rise. "He said something bad would happen if you told." Another affirmative nod. Raphael then did something unexpected. He pushed the blue block away, knocking it over, and brought the yellow one close to what was left of the red one, as if in a farewell. Then he created a new structure, blocks representing his home, his family, Ilara, Gemma, Cecilia. A protective circle. He's saying he's not afraid anymore, Ilara explained, moved, that now he has many people to protect him. Bernard hugged his son tightly, his own tears mingling with the boys. Yes, Raphael, we're all here for you. No one is going to hurt you. And Richard will pay for what he did to Mommy, I promise. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Raphael gently pulled away from his father's hug, looked him in the eyes, and with visible effort, as if breaking an invisible barrier, uttered his first word in 2 years. Dad. The entire room fell silent. Bernard froze, unable to believe what he had just heard. Ilara was smiling, tears of joy streaming down her face. Gemma and Cecilia exchanged emotional glances. Son, Bernard finally managed to say, his voice choked. You spoke. You really spoke. Raphael nodded, his eyes shining with a mixture of fear and triumph. Mom, he said then, pointing to the red block. Mom knew. Yes, she knew, Bernard agreed, holding his son's small hands in his. Mommy found out the truth and was very brave. Just like you're being now. Richard, Raphael continued with difficulty, pointing to the fallen blue block. Bad. Yes, Richard is bad, son, but he's not going to hurt anyone anymore. We'll make sure of that. Raphael seemed to want to say more, but the words were still difficult, like muscles long unused. Ilara came closer and took his hand. It's okay, she said. The words will come back slowly. You've been very brave today. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, exhausted from the day's emotional turmoil, Bernard met with District Attorney Henry at his apartment. He presented all the evidence, the documents found with Cecilia, Dr. Marissa's preliminary analyses of the samples saved by Helen, Lucas's testimony, and perhaps most importantly, a video testimony of Raphael, recorded with care and sensitivity, where the boy, using his new and fragile voice along with the blocks, described what he had witnessed. This is explosive. Bernard, Henry stated after reviewing the material, we're talking about murder, tampering with medical evidence, illegal human trials, large-scale corporate fraud. Richard isn't alone in this. There are bio-neuro executives, other doctors, even officials from regulatory agencies involved. What can we do? I'm opening an official investigation tomorrow. With this evidence, we can get search and seizure warrants for the clinic, for bio-neuro's offices, for Richard's residence. But I must warn you, they will fight with everything they have. They have money, influence, powerful lawyers. I don't care what resources they have, Bernard replied, determined. Helen died trying to expose the truth. Raphael lost 2 years of his childhood, carrying a burden too heavy for him. I'm not giving up now. And what about your safety? Richard has already shown how far he's willing to go to protect his secrets. I've already taken precautions. Tomorrow morning I'm taking Raphael, Ilara, and the 2 grandmothers to my country house in the Hamptons. They'll stay there under constant protection until this is all over. The next morning, as Bernard supervised the preparations for their departure, he received an alarming call from Charles. Sir, we've just discovered that Richard has cancelled all his appointments at the clinic and bought tickets to London. The flight leaves in 4 hours. I think he's trying to flee. He must have realized we're closing in, Bernard concluded. Notify DA Henry immediately. We need to stop him from leaving the country. The events of the next few hours were a whirlwind. While Bernard drove the children and the 2 grandmothers to the safety of the Hamptons, Henry mobilized an operation to arrest Richard before he could board his flight. Upon arriving at the country house, a cozy home surrounded by pine trees, they received the news. Richard had been detained at the airport, trying to board with a fake ID and a suitcase containing nearly $1 million in cash. In the days that followed, the operation expanded. The NeuroLife clinic was shut down for investigation. Bio-neuro executives were indicted, and computers and documents were seized. The revelations about the illegal experiments with neuroxin shocked the medical community and the country. Patients who had been used as guinea pigs without consent began to come forward, their families demanding justice. The press covered every development with intensity, making any attempt to quash the scandal impossible. At the country house, Far from the turmoil, Raphael continued his journey back to verbal communication. The words returned slowly, sometimes in broken sentences, sometimes in simple expressions. Ilara remained by his side, patient, helping him when words failed, celebrating every small progress. One afternoon, while the children played in the garden under the watchful eyes of Cecilia and Gemma, Bernard received a call from Henry. Richard confessed, the DA announced, his voice filled with satisfaction. Confronted with all the evidence, especially Raphael's video testimony, he broke. He confessed to deliberately injecting Helen with neuroxin to silence her, admitted to falsifying medical reports, and acknowledged his participation in the illegal testing scheme. What about the other people involved? Bernard asked. They're falling like dominoes. Richard is turning on everyone in an attempt to get a reduced sentence. BioNeuro is facing billion-dollar lawsuits in the United States and Europe. It's the end of the line for them. After hanging up, Bernard watched Raphael and Ilara running among the trees, laughing. A scene of normal, carefree childhood, something that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. Slowly, he approached the children. "Raphael," he called softly, "I have something to tell you." The boy turned, his eyes now more alive than they had been in years. What, Dad?" "The bad man, Richard, confessed to what he did to Mommy. He's going to be in prison for a very long time. He'll never hurt anyone again." Raphael absorbed the information in silence, then asked in his still fragile voice, "Did he say why?" Bernard crouched down to be at his son's level. "Because Mommy found out he was doing very bad things, hurting people. She wanted to stop him, to protect people. She was very brave, like you." Raphael nodded, processing. "She protected me too." "Yes, son. You protected the evidence she left. You were very brave to keep that secret until it was safe to talk." "No. Scared now," Raphael declared, a new glint of determination in his eyes. "No, we don't need to be scared anymore." That night, while the children slept, Bernard sat on the porch with Gemma and Cecilia, watching the starry sky over the Hamptons. Winter was approaching, bringing with it a refreshing cold that seemed to cleanse not just the air, but also their souls. "I still don't fully understand how Ilara knew," Bernard confessed, looking at Gemma. "How she showed up at my door that day, knowing details no one could have known." Gemma smiled, her wrinkled face illuminated by the soft moonlight. "Some connections transcend what we can rationally explain, Mr. Vanderbilt. Ilara has always had this special sensitivity, this ability to perceive what others miss. When she started dreaming about Raphael, about his block patterns, about a boy silenced by pain, I knew we had to find him. But how did she know where to look?" "Children have their own ways of communicating," Cecilia intervened. "Helen always said Raphael was special, that he noticed things others didn't. Maybe he called out to Ilara in his own way." Bernard contemplated the possibility. After everything he had witnessed in recent weeks, he was less skeptical about inexplicable connections, about the human capacity to transcend physical barriers when the need was great enough. "The important thing," Gemma continued, "is that Raphael is finding his voice again. Not just his words, but his confidence, his joy. And Ilara found a purpose, a precious friendship. Both were lost in their own ways. Together they found a path. 3 months later, with Richard and his accomplices awaiting trial, and the neuroxin scandal still reverberating in the international media, Bernard and Raphael's life had found a new balance. They returned to the apartment in New York City, but visits to Gemma and Cecilia became frequent. The two women, once strangers to each other, had developed a friendship based on their shared love for the children. Bernard reorganized his priorities. The company remained important, but it now occupied its proper place in his life. He began to work more from home, to be present for the significant moments of his son's childhood, to value quality time with Raphael. One Sunday afternoon, during a picnic in Central Park with Ilara and the grandmothers, Raphael surprised everyone by asking to visit the memorial in honor of Helen, which had been inaugurated at St. Monica's Hospital. The site had been created after the case was revealed, with donations from patients and colleagues who admired the courage of the nurse who had sacrificed everything to expose unethical practices. In the small memorial garden, Raphael placed flowers on the plaque that honored his mother. He looked at Helen's smiling image and, with a voice that grew steadier each day, said, "I kept your secret. Mommy, now everyone knows the truth." Bernard, watching the scene with a heart tight with emotion, felt a comforting presence by his side. Ilara took his hand and smiled. "She's listening," the girl said, with that disconcerting certainty that had always characterized her. "She's proud of him. Of both of you." Bernard looked up at the clear sky of that New York Sunday, and for the first time in years felt at peace. The silence that had weighed on his family for so long had been broken. The truth, finally freed, had brought with it not just justice but also healing. Raphael had found his voice. And in that voice, small but growing, Bernard could hear echoes of Helen's courage, Gemma's wisdom, Cecilia's strength, and Ilara's extraordinary sensitivity. The boy who spoke through patterns had finally found words, and with them a bright future was taking shape, no longer in the shadows of trauma, but in the clear light of truth and understanding. A few months later, on Raphael's 7th birthday, a party was held in Gemma's garden. School friends whom the boy had started seeing again ran among the colorful flowers. Ilara, as always, was by his side, helping him when words still failed in moments of excitement or fatigue. During the party, Raphael asked for everyone's attention. With a voice still hesitant but determined, he thanked the friends and the family that had formed around him, not just of blood, but of choice and circumstance. "I want to thank," he said, looking at each face intently, "Ilara, for helping me talk again, Dad, for never giving up, Grandma Cecilia and Grandma Gemma, for taking care of us, and Mommy," his voice broke momentarily, "for being so brave." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Bernard, hugging his son with pride, knew that those simple words represented a monumental victory over silence, fear, and pain. Raphael was no longer the boy who communicated only through colored blocks. He was a child with a voice, with a future, with hope. And as the party continued around him, Bernard exchanged a meaningful look with Gemma. The woman smiled, that wise smile that seemed to understand more than it revealed. "The patterns don't disappear, Mr. Vanderbilt," she said. "They just transform, sometimes into words, sometimes into smiles, sometimes into new ways of seeing the world." Bernard nodded, watching Raphael and Ilara play with other children. The patterns of friendship, trust, and courage forming between them were perhaps the most important of all. Patterns that no trauma could completely erase, that no loss could destroy forever. The silence had been broken, and in the space it once occupied, something new and precious flourished, the truth, told by the voice of a child who had finally found the courage to speak. Time, that great sculptor of destinies, continued its inexorable course. 2 years had passed since the truth about Helen, and the neuroxin scandal was revealed. Raphael, now 9, regularly attended speech therapy sessions, though they were no longer as necessary as before. His voice, once hesitant, gained more confidence each day. And only in moments of great emotion or extreme fatigue did he resort to his old patterns of blocks. Bernard had completely transformed his life and his priorities. Vanderbilt developments continued to prosper, but now under a more shared management, allowing him to dedicate at least half of his week to his son. The Upper East Side penthouse, once a symbol of status and loneliness, had become a true home filled with voices, laughter, and even some welcome mess. Ilara, Raphael's inseparable friend, had practically become part of the family. Her presence was constant on weekends, on outings, at celebrations. The connection between the children, far from diminishing with time, seemed to strengthen with each passing day, evolving from a relationship of support to a genuine friendship based on common interests and mutual trust. On a sunny Saturday morning, Bernard watched the children on the penthouse terrace. Raphael and Ilara were bent over a large jigsaw puzzle, chatting animatedly as they fit the pieces together. Every now and then the boy would pause, thoughtful, as if searching for the exact word, and Ilara would wait patiently, without completing his sentences or rushing him. It was a silent dance they had perfected over the years. "Dad," Raphael called, looking up from the puzzle, "can we go visit Mom's memorial today?" The Helen Montero Memorial at St. Monica's. Hospital had become much more than a simple tribute. It had transformed into a symbol of the fight against unethical practices in medicine and a support center for reporting irregularities in the healthcare system. Helen's courage had inspired other professionals to report similar situations, creating a movement that had already saved countless lives. "Of course we can," Bernard replied, smiling. "Any special occasion?" Raphael exchanged a conspiratorial look with Ilara before answering. "I want to tell her about my school project. I won first place in the science fair." Raphael's project, a study on nonverbal communication and its different patterns in children with trauma, had impressed not only his teachers, but also invited experts. It was clear to everyone that the boy had transformed his own painful experience into something positive, into a quest for understanding that could help other children. Hours later, in the small memorial garden, Raphael carefully placed his science fair certificate next to Helen's smiling photograph. The place was quiet that afternoon, with only a few nurses from the hospital strolling during their break, acknowledging Bernard and the children with respectful smiles. "Look, Mom," Raphael said, adjusting the certificate. "First place. The teacher said my project might help other kids who can't talk after bad things happen." Bernard watched his son with a heart full of pride and a pang of melancholy. Helen would have been so proud of the bright, sensitive boy Raphael was becoming. A boy who, far from hiding his traumatic past, was finding ways to transform it into knowledge and empathy. As Raphael told his mother about his project, in a one-sided conversation laden with emotion, Bernard noticed a woman observing them from a few feet away. Tall, about 40, with short brown hair and attentive eyes, she wore a white lab coat over formal clothes. She seemed to hesitate, as if wanting to approach but unsure if she would be welcome. "Can I help you?" Bernard asked, approaching her. The woman seemed momentarily taken aback, then extended her hand. "Dr. Luciana Prado," she introduced herself. "I'm the new director of the medical ethics department. I'm sorry to watch you like this. I didn't want to interrupt a family moment." "It's all right," Bernard replied. "Raphael likes to come here regularly to talk with his mother." Luciana nodded, a compassionate smile lighting up her face. "I know it might seem strange, but I feel like I already know your family. Helen's case, Nurse Montero's case, has become a required study in our medical ethics program. Her courage changed the way we approach internal reporting and whistleblower protection." Bernard smiled, feeling the familiar mix of pride and pain that always accompanied conversations about Helen's legacy. "She always believed that doing the right thing was worth any sacrifice," he said, looking at his son, who was now showing something on a tablet to Ilara, still near Helen's photograph. "I never imagined her example would have such a broad impact." "Broader than you imagine," Luciana affirmed. "In fact, that's why I wanted to speak with you. We're launching a national program for ethical oversight in medical research, directly inspired by the neuroxin case. We were hoping for your support and, if possible, your participation on the advisory committee." The proposal took Bernard by surprise. In recent years, he had deliberately distanced himself from the medical world, focusing only on his work and Raphael's recovery. The idea of diving back into the issues that had caused his family so much suffering was, to say the least, unsettling. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," he answered honestly. "I don't have a medical background. I don't fully understand research protocols." "What we need aren't more doctors or researchers," Luciana interrupted gently. "We have plenty of those. We need the perspective of someone who has seen firsthand the human cost when ethics are ignored. Someone who can constantly remind us why these rules are important." Bernard watched Raphael and Ilara, now sitting on a nearby bench, talking animatedly. His son had come a long way from the silent boy trapped in his block patterns, and much of that journey had been possible because people like Gemma, Cecilia, Dr. Marissa, and so many others had been willing to get involved, to help, even when it meant facing painful situations. "I'll think about it," he promised. "I need to talk to Raphael first. Any involvement with this case directly affects his life." Luciana seemed satisfied with his answer. "That's fair, and it says a lot about you as a father that you put his needs first." She handed Bernard a card. "When you decide, no matter what your answer is, please get in touch." That night, after dropping Ilara off and putting Raphael to bed, Bernard sat on the penthouse balcony, contemplating the lights of New York City. Luciana's proposal echoed in his mind, stirring conflicting feelings. On one hand, there was the desire to honor Helen's memory and sacrifice, to ensure her courage had not been in vain. On the other, the fear of reopening wounds that were just beginning to heal, of exposing Raphael once again to the shadows of the past. His phone buzzed with a message from Gemma. "The children told us about the meeting at the memorial today. Some doors open at the exact moment we are ready to walk through them. Trust your instincts and Raphael's." Bernard smiled. Gemma and her mysterious ability to always know what was going on, even when no one told her directly. Over the years, he had learned to respect that extraordinary intuition, that wisdom that transcended rational explanations. The next morning, during breakfast, Bernard broached the subject with his son. "Raphael, I need to ask you something important," he began, pouring orange juice for the boy. "How would you feel if I got involved in some work related to what happened to Mummy? Work to help prevent similar things from happening to other people." Raphael stopped chewing his toast, thoughtful, his eyes so much like Helen's fixed on his father's with surprising intensity. "Would it be like continuing her work?" he finally asked. Bernard nodded. "In a way, yes. Helping to ensure that doctors follow important rules, that patients are protected, that brave people like Mommy don't have to risk so much to do the right thing." Raphael was silent for a few moments, processing the information. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. "I think Mommy would like that. And so would I, but, Bernard encouraged when his son hesitated. "But I don't want you to be sad again like before. Or too busy like when she was here." The observation hit Bernard like a punch to the gut. Raphael's perception of the past was painfully accurate. Before losing Helen, he had been too busy with his company, rarely present, missing precious moments he could never get back. And after the tragedy, he had sunk into a deep sadness, physically present but emotionally distant. "I promise that won't happen," he said, holding his son's hand. "You will always be my priority. And if at any point this work starts to make me sad or too busy, I'll stop. Deal?" Raphael smiled, that luminous smile that was like a ray of sunshine after a storm. "Deal. And can I help too?" "How so?" "I can tell my story to the doctors, the students, show them what it's like when a child loses their words. Maybe that will help them understand why the rules are important." Bernard felt a lump in his throat. His son's generosity, his willingness to turn his own pain into an instrument of change, was impressive and moving. "Only if you really want to, son. And only when you feel completely ready." "I do," Raphael affirmed, with a determination that was so reminiscent of Helen. "Ilara said our stories can be lights for other people in the dark. I want to be a light, like Mommy was." In the following weeks, Bernard and Raphael began a new journey together. The ethics committee, led by Dr. Luciana, welcomed them with open arms, valuing not only the unique perspective they brought, but also the powerful symbolism of their participation. The pilot program was launched in 5 major New York hospitals, with plans for national expansion the following year. It established secure and anonymous channels for reporting ethical irregularities, guaranteed legal protection for whistleblowers, and implemented regular independent audits of medical research, especially those funded by pharmaceutical companies, and perhaps most significantly, it included a mandatory educational program for doctors and researchers, where the neurotoxin case was studied in depth. During one of these training sessions, Raphael made his first public appearance alongside his father. In front of an audience of healthcare professionals, the boy shared his experience, what it was like to lose his voice after witnessing something terrible, how block patterns became his only form of communication, and how he finally found his way back to words. "When adults break important rules," he said, with a surprising eloquence for a 9-year-old, "children can break on the inside. Please remember that when you're doing your job." The entire room fell silent, many with tears in their eyes. Raphael's simple and direct message touched their hearts in a way no ethics manual or regulation ever could. On the way home after the event, Bernard noticed his son was unusually quiet. "Are you okay?" he asked, concerned. "Was it too hard for you to talk about that today?" Raphael shook his head. "It wasn't hard. It was important, but I was thinking about something." "What? Are there other kids like me? Kids who saw bad things and lost their words?" The question took Bernard by surprise. It was something he himself often wondered. "Probably yes," he answered honestly. "Unfortunately, many children go through traumatic experiences. What if we made a place for them, A place with people like Ilara who understand the patterns, where they can find their words again like I did. The idea was as simple as it was brilliant: a specialized center for alternative communication for traumatized children, using the techniques that had helped Raphael, combining the intuitive wisdom of people like Gemma with the science of professionals like Dr. Marissa. That's an incredible idea, Raphael. Truly incredible. The boy smiled, satisfied. We can call it the Helen Project, to make Mommy happy. That night, after Raphael fell asleep, Bernard called Gemma and Cecilia, sharing his son's idea. Both women received the proposal with enthusiasm, immediately offering their support and participation. The boy has his mother's vision and his father's entrepreneurial spirit, Cecilia commented, with evident pride in her voice. And something more, Gemma added in her ever-mysterious tone, something that is uniquely his, a special sensitivity born from his own pain. In the months that followed, the Helen Project began to take shape. Bernard made an entire floor of one of his commercial buildings available to house the center. Professionals from various fields, psychologists, speech therapists, art therapists, volunteered to join the multidisciplinary team. Gemma took on the role of coordinating the pattern interpreters, sensitive people like Ilara, capable of building bridges with children who had lost the ability to communicate verbally. The first case arrived even before the official opening. A 6-year-old girl, Mariana, who hadn't spoken in 8 months since witnessing a serious accident involving her older brother. Like Raphael, she had developed her own communication system, based on repetitive drawings of waves and circles. On Mariana's first day at the center, still in its testing phase, Raphael insisted on being present. Under Gemma's supervision, he approached the girl who was drawing compulsively in a corner of the colorful room. "Hi, Mariana," he said, sitting next to her. "I know what it's like not to be able to talk." "It happened to me, too." The girl looked up, surprised. There was something in Raphael's tone, in the simple sincerity of his words, that captured her attention in a way no adult had managed to do. "Can I draw with you?" he asked. When she nodded shyly, Raphael began to reproduce the pattern of waves and circles she was creating. Bernard, watching the interaction through the glass window of the room, felt a deep emotion seeing his son naturally take on the role Ilara had played for him. The circle was complete. Pain transformed into understanding, experience into wisdom, trauma into healing, not just for himself, but for others. Beside him, Gemma smiled, as if watching the unfolding of something she had always known would happen. "The patterns always find their way, don't they?" she commented, enigmatic as ever. "What do you mean?" Bernard asked, without taking his eyes off the interaction between Raphael and Mariana. "The patterns of pain, of healing, of connection. They repeat through generations, through lives like echoes." Raphael lost his voice and found it again thanks to Ilara. Now he becomes the bridge for Mariana. And one day, perhaps, Mariana will do the same for another child. That's how true healing happens. Not just by healing yourself, but by carrying that healing forward. Inside the room, something extraordinary was happening. Mariana, who had only communicated through drawings for the past months, picked up a different pencil and wrote something next to her last circle, her own name. A small but significant step, a first move toward words. Raphael looked at the window, meeting his father's gaze, and smiled, a radiant smile of triumph and hope. Bernard felt tears in his eyes, not of sadness but of a deep and complex happiness. The journey that had begun in the most absolute pain was now blossoming into something beautiful and meaningful. That night, as they had done hundreds of times in recent years, father and son visited Helen's memorial. The place was quiet, softly lit by small lights embedded in the garden. Raphael placed a drawing made by Mariana next to his mother's photograph. "Look, Mom," he said, his voice clear and confident. "We're helping another child find her words, just like you wanted to help people who couldn't defend themselves. I think you'd be happy." Bernard put his arm around his son's shoulders, feeling the comforting weight of the boy against his side. Raphael was growing, not just physically but in wisdom and understanding. The silence that had once been his prison had now transformed into a powerful tool, the ability to recognize and respect the silence of others, to see the hidden patterns where others saw only inexplicable behavior. "She would be so proud of you." "Son," Bernard said, his voice choked with emotion, I am. Every single day. Raphael looked at his father, his eyes reflecting a maturity that transcended his 9 years. I'm proud of both of us, Dad. We built something good out of something bad. I think that's what matters in the end. As they walked back to the car under the starry New York sky, Bernard reflected on the extraordinary journey they had traveled. From absolute silence to the first whispers, from block towers to confident speeches, from repetitive patterns to creating new paths. Raphael had not only found his own voice, but was now helping others find theirs. And in that process, something unexpected had happened. The void left by Helen would never be completely filled, but around it, a new constellation of connections, purposes, and meanings had emerged. An extended family that included Gemma and Ilara, Cecilia, Dr. Marissa, and now Mariana and all the children who would come after her. The boy who spoke through patterns had become an interpreter, a bridge, a beacon. And in this transformation, Bernard had found not only healing for his son but also for himself. The businessman focused solely on professional success had given way to a man who understood the value of human connections, the importance of being truly present, the transformative power of listening not just to words, but to the silences between them. As the car glided through the illuminated city streets, Raphael fell asleep in the back seat, his head resting against the window. Watching him in the rearview mirror, Bernard felt a wave of gratitude. For his son's life, for Helen's memory, for all the people who had helped them along the way, and even for the hardships they had faced, for it was those hardships that had forged them into who they had become. At a red light, Bernard looked again at his sleeping son and whispered, "Thank you for never giving up, Raphael, for showing us the way back to words." The light turned green, green as hope, and the car moved forward into the night, taking father and son home, not just to the apartment where they lived, but to the home they had built together, made not of walls and ceilings, but of understanding, acceptance, and unconditional love. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Bernard and Raphael has touched your hearts. This journey of overcoming reminds us of the power of truth and the courage that exists even in the smallest among us. For more emotional stories like this, we have a special playlist prepared for you. Just click on the left to discover new narratives ranging from family mysteries to journeys of personal triumph. If this story about a boy who found his voice against all odds moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who would also appreciate this message of hope. Every day we bring new American stories that explore the complexity of life and the beauty of human connections. Which city are you tuning in from today? Let us know in the comments and join this community that loves good stories.